The bar on Ket Station didn't have a name. It didn't need one. Every trader, mercenary, and black market broker within 6 parsecs knew the place by reputation alone. By the way the air tasted like recycled coolant and something faintly biological, by the fact that the lighting had been broken for 11 years and nobody fixed it because the dark was considered a feature. You came to the nameless bar when you wanted a drink no customs officer would inspect, a deal no port authority would record, or a fight no magistrate would investigate. On this particular night, Yeva Dolgova was here for the drink. She sat at the far end of the bar with her back against the wall, a habit so old it had become involuntary, like breathing, nursing something amber and aggressively alcoholic that the bartender had called local vintage with the absolute confidence of a man who had never once told the truth. She was off duty. She was tired. The cargo run from the Meridian Belt had taken 3 weeks longer than projected. The ship's thermal regulator had developed an opinion about when it wanted to work, and she had eaten nothing but protein ration blocks for 9 days straight. She was not looking for trouble. Trouble, however, had been looking for her. His name, as she would later learn from the station's incident report, was Grevak Dul, a Thyssian male of middling height and considerable enthusiasm for his own myth. He stood nearly 2 meters tall, which was impressive until you understood that Thyssians were a species that had evolved on a low-gravity moon and consequently had the bone density of balsa wood wrapped in the aesthetic of a predator. They had 4 arms. Yes, they had retractable claws, technically. They were considered intimidating by roughly 60% of the species in the known galaxy, primarily the ones that had never spent time around humans and therefore had no reference point for what genuinely dangerous looked like. Grevak had been watching Yeva for 40 minutes. She had noticed in the first 30 seconds. She'd spent the remaining 39 minutes and 30 seconds deciding whether he was going to be a problem or just a curiosity. The answer revealed itself when he pushed off his stool, crossed the bar with the swagger of a man who had never once had his threat assessment be wrong, and put all 4 of his hands on the counter around her drink. "You're in my seat," he said. Yeva looked at him. She looked at the seat she was occupying. She looked back at him. "There's no name on it," she said. "There is now." He leaned in. The claws emerged, slowly, theatrically, the way you do things when you've practiced them in front of mirrors. "The name is mine." Yeva took a slow drink of her very bad alcohol and set the glass down with extreme care, the way a person does when they are making a decision and they want the deciding to be deliberate. She was from Earth. Specifically, she was from a region of Earth that the rest of the planet called, with a kind of exhausted respect, the deep interior, a place where winters lasted half the year, where the wildlife had never quite gotten the memo that humans were apex predators and therefore still occasionally tried to test the theory, and where children learned before they learned to read that the world was trying to kill you, and the only appropriate response was to be harder to kill than the world expected. She had spent the first 18 years of her life in that place. She had spent the following 12 years in deep space freight and the 5 years before that in a colonial defense unit that operated in regions politely described by the Interstellar Authority as contested and impolitely described by the people who lived there as catastrophically on fire. She was 35 years old. She was 5 feet 7 inches tall. She weighed 68 kilograms, of which approximately 0 were wasted. Grevak Dul looked at her and saw a small, lone human female, off-duty, possibly drunk, definitely tired, in a bar that didn't have a name and didn't have witnesses who volunteered information to station security. He reached into his belt with his lower left hand and produced a blade. It was Thyssian-made, curved, with a serrated edge along the inner curve that was designed to make extraction as problematic as insertion, a serious weapon. An instrument designed not merely to wound, but to demonstrate. "Last chance," he said. "For you," Yeva agreed, and moved. The thing non-humans consistently failed to understand about humans, and this failure was documented, studied, and had resulted in the publication of no fewer than 47 academic papers by xenoanthropologists across 6 species, was the gap between what a human looked like and what a human was. Visually, humans were unremarkable. Soft skin, no claws, no venom, no exoskeleton, no echolocation, no infrared vision, no electromagnetic sense. Bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, fragile in appearance. Most species, encountering humans for the first time, assessed them as prey. This was an error. What those species did not see, could not see without context, was the several 100,000-year audit of violence and survival that had shaped the species from the inside out. Humans were not apex predators in the traditional sense. They were something stranger and more unsettling, which was generalist survivors who had learned to be the most dangerous thing in any environment, not by being stronger than everything else, but by being more adaptable than everything else, by being willing to use any tool, learn any trick, endure any hardship, remember any lesson, and pass that lesson down so the next generation started from a higher baseline of dangers. The Thessians' claws were biological. They didn't choose them. They didn't practice with them. They just had them. Yeva Dolgova's hands were something different entirely. When she moved the way things move when they have been moving in exactly that way for a very long time. There was no hesitation, there was no telegraphing. The drink was set down in the same motion that brought her off the stool, and by the time Grevak's higher cognitive centers had processed, she is standing up, his lower left wrist was already being rotated in a direction wrists are not supposed to rotate. The knife did not clatter to the floor dramatically. It was taken, controlled, redirected, still in motion, its momentum used rather than stopped, and ended up somewhere that Grevak had not anticipated, which was pressed with precision against the soft connective tissue of his lower right elbow joint, which on a Thessian is both load-bearing for the lower limb pair and approximately as armored as a firm handshake. Grevak froze. The bar didn't go quiet. It was that kind of bar. It had seen this before, or things like it, and the ambient noise of people pretending not to watch while watching was its own kind of sound. "Here is the situation," Yeva said, in the tone of someone conducting a business meeting in a room that has already been booked. "You have 4 arms. Right now I have positive control of 2 of them, and I'm holding your own blade against a joint that I could damage without killing you, which matters because dead you is a paperwork problem, and injured you is just a lesson." She tilted her head slightly. "Your remaining upper left hand is moving toward your belt. Please stop that." The upper left hand stopped. "Good. Now, the seat." She applied just enough pressure on the elbow to underscore the grammar. "You can have it. I was done with my drink. What you cannot have is the impression that this worked the way you expected it to. You went looking for an easy mark. I understand the logic. Lone human, late hour, dark bar, isolated from any obvious backup. That reads as soft target in most encounter tables." She released one wrist, but kept the blade. "The problem is that the encounter table doesn't include planetary origin data. If it did, you'd know that I grew up in a place that would kill you before breakfast, just with the ambient conditions. Hypothermia, wolf packs, that kind of thing. We're not soft, we just look it." She stepped back, flipped the knife so the handle faced him, and set it on the bar. "Take it," she said, "and go find a different species to bother." Grevak Dul looked at her for a long moment. His 4 arms did various things that Thessian body. Language scholars would have identified as expressions of redirected aggression and recalibrating threat assessment. Then he picked up his knife, did not say a word, and left. The bartender refilled Yeva's glass without being asked. "On the house," he said. "You saw that?" she asked. "Everybody saw that." He paused. "Also, he's been doing that to travelers for 6 months. Station security doesn't do anything because nobody on the crew reports it. They're embarrassed. He set the glass in front of her. You're the first one to turn it around. Yeva considered that. He'll try it again, she said. On someone else. Probably. That's a problem. The bartender looked at her carefully. You have somewhere to be? Yeva thought about her ship. She thought about the thermal regulator. She thought about 9 days of protein blocks and a berth that smelled like recycled atmosphere and the particular loneliness of the deep space freight life, which was not romantic despite what the entertainment programs implied. Not immediately, she said. The 6 months that followed Grevak Dul's predatory relationship with Ket Station's traveler population became, upon investigation, considerably more organized than anyone had realized. He wasn't operating alone. He had 3 associates, all Thyssian, all operating out of a cargo bay on the station's lower ring that Port Authority had logged as a storage rental for agricultural equipment, and had not checked because the bribe for not checking had been quietly consistent and delivered on time, which in the hierarchy of station administration outranked actual compliance with any regulatory framework. They had a system. Grevak was the initiator, the face, the weapon. His 3 associates covered exits, ran interference with anyone who looked like they might intervene, and handled the post-encounter logistics of relieving the mark of cargo manifests, access codes, credit chips, or anything else worth having. They had been running this operation for the better part of a standard year. Yeva found all of this out because she asked. This was, again, a thing non-humans consistently underestimated about humans, the comprehensive nature of their information gathering when they had decided something was a problem. Yeva spent 2 days just talking to people. Traders who'd been hit, station workers who'd seen things, the bartender who turned out to know a startling amount, a freight coordinator named Obi who had lost 3 months of cargo data to the operation and had been eating the liability because he couldn't prove anything to the Port Authority's satisfaction. Yeva came from a species that had invented bureaucracy. She understood intimately what it took to satisfy one. She also came from a species that, when bureaucracy failed, had a long tradition of direct action. She spent 1 more day constructing a paper trail, filing the right incident reports, citing the right regulations, attaching statements from the right witnesses, and structuring it in the format that the Ket Station Port Authority's complaint intake system was specifically designed to accept and specifically failed to process properly unless the intake form was cross-referenced with the safety incident log, using a procedure that was listed in Appendix C of a handbook last updated 9 years ago and that nobody in current administration had read. She had read it in an afternoon. The Port Authority opened an official investigation into the agricultural equipment storage bay 2 days later, which resulted in the discovery of considerably more than agricultural equipment and the arrests of 3 of Grevak's 4 associates before they could arrange alternative accommodations. Grevak himself required a different approach. He found her at the docking ring. She had been expecting this. You don't dismantle someone's livelihood on a space station and then find it surprising when they appear looking upset. Yeva had been expecting it for 48 hours, had not changed her routine because changing your routine signals anticipation and anticipation signals fear, and she was not afraid of Grevak Dul for the same reason that she was not afraid of the animal traps her grandfather used to set around the perimeter of their property during the long winters. The ones that could take a hand off if you put it in the wrong place without thinking. You respected them. You did not fear them. They were mechanisms. They had no malice, only mechanism. Grevak had malice. That made him more dangerous than a trap. It also made him less dangerous than she was, but she didn't say that out loud because she'd had the opportunity to say it once and it hadn't changed his behavior, so clearly the message wasn't delivered in a format he could process. He came with the blade and with 2 of his remaining free associates, large Thyssian males who had not been in the cargo bay when the authority arrived, and therefore had not been arrested, and were currently operating on the combined logic that 4 arms plus 4 arms plus 4 arms divided by one tired human equaled a favorable outcome. Yeva looked at the three of them. She was at a section of docking ring that was technically public but practically empty at this hour. She had not chosen it by accident. With her own ship's loading ramp 20 meters behind her, and the distinct and unmistakable shape of Obi the freight coordinator visible at the far end of the corridor, which Grevak either hadn't noticed or had decided was irrelevant. "You cost me everything on this station," Grevak said. His 4 hands were doing the thing again. The display, the posturing, the claws emerging at the same theatrical pace as the first time, which told Yeva that this was rehearsed behavior, and that he was running the same program he always ran, and had not updated it despite the evidence. "You cost yourself everything on this station," she said. "I just filed the paperwork. Give me the code to your cargo manifest, and leave this sector before morning, and I let you walk." Yeva considered this offer for precisely the amount of time it deserved. "No," she said. He moved. And here is the thing about someone who has spent 35 years in a world that is actively trying to kill them. They have been practicing since they could walk. Not in a formal dojo, not in a class, in the actual world, against actual consequences, in conditions where the penalty for a mistake wasn't points lost on a scoreboard, but a winter that didn't care whether you were sorry. Yeva had been in 11 formal combat situations in her colonial defense years. She had been in something closer to 300 informal ones over the course of a life lived in hard places among beings that tested hardness. She had a scar on her left forearm from a wolf trap at age 9. She had a scar on her collarbone from a debris fragment at age 23. She had a dozen minor ones she'd stopped cataloging. What she did not have, had never had, not once, in 35 years, was the luxury of assuming that being in the right made you safe. You were only safe if you were capable, and capable meant practicing, and practicing meant that when Grevak Dul came at her with his blade and his associates came wide on the left and right to box her, the response was not panic or heroics. It was geometry. She let the left associate come too far in before the right one reached his position. She stepped into Grevak's attack rather than back from it, which was the counterintuitive move that worked precisely because it was counterintuitive. Inside his reach, where the blade was neither here nor there, where his 4 arms were actually a liability because they got in each other's way. She used his momentum. She used the wall. She used the fact that Thisian physiology puts its center of gravity slightly higher than human physiology, which means that a controlled disruption of the base results in a very sudden and very complete loss of standing. Grevak went down. The left associate was dealt with next, not elegantly, because elegance was for situations with margin, and this didn't have margin. With the kind of efficient violence that colonial defense training produces, minimum input, maximum consequence, as little time spent on it as possible. The right associate stopped. He looked at Grevak on the floor. He looked at his associate against the wall. He looked at Yeva, who was breathing slightly faster than normal, and had nothing in her hands except the ambient authority of someone who has just made a case with their body that their mouth couldn't improve on. Then he looked at Obi, who had walked up during the proceeding and was quietly and thoroughly documenting everything on a station-grade recording device. The right associate left. Yeva looked down at Grevak, who was not unconscious but was re-evaluating several foundational beliefs about the universe in real time. "The blade," she said. He gave it to her. She turned it over in her hand. It was actually well made. She could appreciate that. The serration was precise. The balance was good. Whoever had forged it had known what they were doing, and she had a certain respect for craft, regardless of the intentions of the person wielding it. "I'm keeping this," she said. "Consider it a fee for the consultation." She walked back to her ship. Behind her, she heard Obi calling station security, which this time would have documentation sufficient to satisfy Appendix C and every other appendix in the handbook. The story spread, as stories do on space stations, which are small and slow, and populated by people who have a great deal of time and a conversational economy that runs on interesting things that happened to other people. By the end of the week, 3 versions were circulating. In the first, Yeva had disarmed Grevak in under a second. In the second, she'd done it without putting down her drink. In the third, she had said something magnificent and devastating that varied in each retelling based on what the reteller found most satisfying to imagine someone saying in that situation. None of the versions were quite accurate. None of them were quite wrong. What they had in common was the detail that mattered. One human, alone, tired, off-duty, had encountered a predator who had selected her because she looked like the easiest option, and had turned that selection into a mistake so complete it had dismantled his entire operation. The bartender, whose name was Tessin, and who had not survived 20 years running a bar in a station without a name by being unobservant, said later that he had known in the first 30 seconds. Not that she would win. He hadn't known the specifics. What he'd known was the look. He'd seen it before in the handful of other humans who'd passed through over the years, and he'd never seen it in anything else. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't bravado. It was something quieter and more serious, something that sat behind the eyes like a very calm calculation that had been running for years and simply had not been queried yet. Humans, Tessin explained to anyone who would listen, and several who wouldn't, were the only species he'd ever encountered that could be completely relaxed and completely ready at the same time. Everything else he'd met was one or the other. You were calm or you were alert, resting or coiled. Humans somehow occupied both states simultaneously, as if their nervous system had made a policy decision early in the species. Development that downtime was a myth, and the correct attitude was to enjoy the moment you were in, while remaining entirely prepared for the moment to change. This was, though Tessin didn't have the technical language for it, accurate. The evolutionary pressures of a death world didn't produce species that could turn it off. A predator on Earth's savannah didn't wait for the lion to enter the camp before checking where the exits were. A person in the deep interior didn't go to sleep without knowing what was outside the door. You built the awareness into the rest state. You made it cheap enough to maintain continuously that there was no reason to turn it off. And you did this for so many generations that the species that emerged on the other end was one that, when violence became necessary, found it neither unfamiliar nor particularly frightening. Just another problem, solved with the tools available. What Grevak had never understood, what he had never been equipped to understand, was that the target he had selected in the dark bar was not a small, tired, off-duty human female at the end of a rough cargo run. She was a human female at the end of a rough cargo run. Yes, all of that was true. But she was also the distilled output of hundreds of thousands of years of a species that had never once had the luxury of being the most dangerous thing in its environment, and had compensated for this by becoming more dangerous than whatever the most dangerous thing was. He had seen prey. He had found the distillation of a death world's entire educational curriculum, expressed in one person, sitting at a bar. The knife, his knife, the good one with the precise serration and the excellent balance, sat on Yeva's shelf. She'd cleaned it properly. She didn't carry it. It wasn't her style. But she kept it because it was a good blade and because she had a certain sentimental attachment to objects that represented the moment a situation resolved correctly. She had a few of those. Yeva Dolgova left Ket Station 8 days after she'd arrived. The thermal regulator had been fixed. A contact Obi had given her, a mechanic who owed him a favor that was now technically owed to Yeva, which was how the economy of small stations worked. The cargo she'd come to pick up was loaded, the paperwork was filed, the port authority had, with something approaching gratitude though not quite reaching it, issued her a formal notice of commendation for her assistance with the Grevak Dul investigation, which she could theoretically use in future dealings with port authorities across the sector, though she suspected the occasions where that would be relevant were limited. She sat in the pilot's seat as the station fell behind her and the stars reasserted their indifference, and she thought, as she sometimes did, in the long, quiet hours of deep space freight when there was nothing to do but watch the darkness, about what it meant to be what she was. Human. From Earth. From the specific and particular school that Earth ran. The one that didn't hand out diplomas, but instead handed out scars and experience and the bone-deep knowledge that the universe was not designed for your convenience, and the only appropriate response to this was to be inconvenient back. She thought about Grevak selecting her. She thought about the logic of it, which was not wrong exactly. It was just working from incomplete information. The galaxy was still learning about humans, 100 years into serious interstellar contact, and most species still didn't have a fully updated encounter table. They knew humans were all over the place. They knew humans were persistent and strange, and had a relationship with discomfort that bordered on pathological. But they hadn't quite completed the threat assessment. Hadn't quite internalized that the species that looked the softest had survived the hardest classroom. Someday they would. Someday the information would propagate far enough, and completely enough, that no being anywhere would look at a lone, tired, off-duty human in a dark bar and make the mistake of seeing easy. Until then, she supposed, there would be more Grevaks, more knives produced with theatrical slowness, more four-armed beings who had done their math on the wrong variables. She was not angry about this. She didn't have the energy for it, and besides, anger was not a useful fuel for the long haul. What she had instead was the equanimity of someone who had made peace with being systematically underestimated, and had found, over many years, that being underestimated was not a vulnerability. It was a resource. She pulled up the next cargo manifest on her screen. The run was to a mid-tier station near the Crescent Worlds. A long haul, 8 days in the deep, nothing dramatic on the route flags. The kind of run that would be mostly quiet and would involve a lot of protein blocks and recycled air and the specific loneliness she'd stopped fighting somewhere around year 7 of freight work. She didn't mind it. She'd grown up in the kind of place where the silence tried to kill you if you weren't paying attention. She'd learned to pay attention. The deep space silence was different. It wasn't trying to kill her, just containing her. And there was a kind of companionship in that, the way there's companionship in anything that's honest about what it is. Somewhere on the station behind her, Tessin was refilling drinks and telling someone about the night a human came in and showed a Thisian the educational gap between looking dangerous and being it. Somewhere in the station's processing, the formal incident report was becoming precedent in the Port Authority system. Somewhere in a cell in the station's security wing, 3 Thisians were reconsidering their operational choices. And somewhere on her shelf, a knife with excellent balance and precise serration was riding out into deep space, having changed employers permanently. Yeva set the thermal regulator to maintain and let the stars take her. She was from Earth. She was harder to kill than anything in this sector had yet bothered to imagine. And she was, despite everything, in a fine mood. Enjoyed this story. If you're new to the HFY genre, that's humanity, Yeva. Welcome. These are the stories where humans aren't the weakest species in the galaxy. They're the ones who grew up on a world that wanted them dead, and they carry that education everywhere they go. Drop a comment with your favorite HFY moment. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that small doesn't mean soft, and subscribe for more stories where humanity's greatest superpower turns out to be the thing everyone else wrote off as a liability. The Deathworld sends its regards.